Hi, and welcome to the Keys to Therapy. Today's guest is Dr. Tara. Hi, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Dr. Tara Overzat from Atlanta, Georgia. How are you doing, Samantha?
Oh, I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing good, thanks.
Hey, I'm glad you made the time to come do this today. I feel like we got really good topics to talk about, so I'm ready to get into it.
Awesome.
Well, do you want to tell the audience a little bit more about who you are and what you do before we get started?
Sure. I'm a trauma therapist down in Atlanta, Georgia. I also work on the intersection of mental health and climate change and do some
Mhm.
volunteering with Citizens Climate Lobby on that front. And I've been a therapist since 2012.
Awesome. Okay, good. So lots of experience.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, what made you want to become a therapist to begin with? How'd you get into this field?
It's so funny. I often say that therapy or counseling found me versus me
Hmm.
finding it. I was always that person growing up that people would just confide in and talk to about all sorts of things. And I remember thinking, well, this must happen to everybody. And then I started talking to folks who are like, no, I've never had that happen to me. Or like, maybe once. What do you mean this happens to you like every week? Um, and then I was speaking to a professional in the field who, I was looking for career advice in general. And he said, well, you could do, this. I'm like, do what? Like, he's like, therapy. You seem like you'd be a really good fit for that.
Oh,
And so I started thinking about it more, doing some research, and I wound up applying to a few different schools, got into Mercer University in Atlanta, did my master's and PhD there. And I've been in Atlanta the whole time and
mhm.
continue to work at Mercer now as an adjunct.
Oh, amazing. Cool. Well, did you know
Yeah.
you wanted to get into teaching?
No, that's the funny thing. And I'm certain there's probably professors at Mercer who laugh about this because I was very adamant in my PhD program that I didn't want to be a professor, didn't want to be tenure track. I have a teaching background. I taught when I was younger in my 20s.
Oh,
I'm like,
wow.
but I think, yeah, but I'm like, oh, I think that's behind me though. And then when I graduated in spring of 2019, my department chair, who was also my dissertation chair, she really encouraged me to think about teaching a couple of classes while I was getting my private practice started.
Oh.
And it wound up being a really wonderful fit, more so than I ever thought it would have been. So here I am, 5 years later, still teaching. I teach assessment, I teach ethics, and I teach the trauma classes in summer.
Oh, do you have a favorite of those?
You're not supposed to have a favorite child, but I do.
Yeah.
And for me, it's definitely the trauma class.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's perfect then for what we're gonna talk about today. So,
Okay.
awesome. Well, I know with your therapy, you tend to focus on people who've been through, trauma or significant changes in their life, and
Yeah.
that's been sort of your niche. So,
hmm
what drew you to that, and why was that the focus for you?
Yeah, that's really interesting because it didn't start out that way.
Okay.
At first, I was very open to, I'll give therapy wherever to whomever. You know how it is
Mhm.
when you first start grad school. It's like,
Yeah.
you don't really know yet.
Right.
And then I did my practicum and internship at Talbot Recovery Campus, which is a substance abuse facility. It's inpatient. They have an outpatient program as well, but I was mostly in the inpatient program. And that was at the time long term care. People were there a
Mhm.
minimum of 3 months getting services. And that was a really wonderful experience to see how people could turn their lives around, even when substance abuse had derailed everything in their life. And along the way, you start noticing commonalities and stories.
Mhm.
Like people may come from different backgrounds, the details are different, but everyone seemed to have a trauma. At the time, I wasn't calling it trauma, but I was like, there seems to be bad things that have happened in their childhood, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then, fast forward a few years, and I'm noticing that in other areas in counseling as well. And so a colleague had recommended I try getting EMDR certified. So I went
Mhm.
ahead and did that. And that was really eye opening for me. As part of that training, we ourselves, received EMDR therapy.
Yeah.
And that shifted so much of how I see things also. And, traumas I was holding on to that I wasn't even fully cognizant of. Like, not that it's, because there was that whole thing in the 80s about repressed memories, and that's not
Right.
what it is. But just knowing that there was a heaviness I still had with me that I was maybe not able to resolve as easily through talk therapy. So
Mhm.
it's a very long answer to your question, but all these things over time kind of built on top of each other. And I realized trauma is what I want to specialize in.
Yeah, no, I like that there's been it's not like you didn't come into this journey with that end goal. It's sort of
Mm-mm.
evolved as your experience evolved. And I think that that's really helpful for new therapists to understand too, or even
Mhm.
established therapists who are still trying to find their way and what they want to focus on, because it isn't just the first job you have or the
Mm-mm.
one client you really click with or whatever else. It's something that over time you start to realize, like, what are you actually interested in? Who are the
Right.
people and the stories and the things that you want to learn more about and get more training in and things like
Mhm.
that. So I think that that's really cool that you paid attention to those things for yourself.
Mhm.
So I've seen a lot of posts in some of like the recent therapy Facebook groups of people saying like, what niche is the most profitable or which niche,
Mm.
whatever. And it's
Yeah.
like, it's not about that, because in order to sustain yourself in the field, you have to be working with the kind of clients and in the type of topics that are going to sustain you. So I
Mhm.
really like that you found something that you had a personal connection to that population and really found like your way through that. And then again, got EMDR trained and stuff like that to help them even more.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely, and I do think it is, like you said, an evolution over time, and
mhm,
that always kinda disappoints me when I hear people say, "How do I make money doing this?"
mhm,
Because, of course, we live in a society where you need money to survive and all that, but it's like, "Ooh, this isn't a field where you." Some people, we have our superstars, we have, like, Brené Brown and stuff
mhm,
who do make a lot of money, but that's not the norm, unfortunately, for the field, and that's been an ongoing issue with insurance parity and all that, but
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's hard because I think people sometimes focus on like where are their therapists lacking, which
Mm.
that it makes sense to look at that, but you also have to look at what fuels you as the therapist. You're gonna get burned out.
Yes. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Even
Mhm.
if you're working with a niche that maybe is profitable in some way or is lacking in, clinicians in some way. Now you're the specialist. I think
Mhm.
if you aren't tied into that or have some kind of personal passion for that population, it doesn't matter how much you're making or how many
Right.
clients you have, you're gonna get burned out.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I like too that you talked about focusing on trauma, but then also like resiliency is something
Mhm.
that I know is a big focus for you as well, because
Yeah.
I think sometimes with trauma is a heavy topic.
Mhm.
So, and there's, like you mentioned earlier, kind of lots of different types of traumas and different
Oh,
things that
yes.
weigh differently. So
Mhm.
I like that you also throw in the resiliency part too, because I feel like it adds some hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there is, the sort of that post-traumatic growth or a life after trauma, right?
Mhm.
And teaching people how to move forward, never diminishing that trauma, never saying it didn't happen or devaluing it in any way, but just like we can learn what new normal is for you and how to walk in new normal. I think is really important, especially as things continue to happen in our world. Our world has always had problems, but now we have, AI and the fact that I can pick up my phone at any time and see 50 things on my feed of terrible stuff happening.
Yeah.
That's new for us as human beings. And so having that resiliency becomes ever more important.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point with the technology too, because at no other point in history were people exposed to this many stories of other people's
Mhm.
lives. And not even just the stories, the images, the videos, like,
Yes.
and I feel like these last few years, especially, like it's social media has grown so much and it has a ton of great things about it, but it is hard. I know even on like my own Instagram feed, if I'm scrolling, I'm like, here's some dog videos, here's some dessert accounts I follow.
Mhm.
And then the next thing will be a news story about somebody that was murdered. And it's like,
Right, it's jarring.
mhm.
Mhm.
And you can't always control it. I mean, because especially because I'll be following something that's like a celebrity thing, like People Magazine or
Mhm,
like something.
sure, yeah, something lighthearted, right.
Right. And now it's like JLo's getting divorced. And I'm like, well, of course. And then the next People Magazine, scroll will say something about a murder or some kind of
Right.
like, something terrible that has happened. And so it is tough that we're exposed to it. And I think for so many people, it's like you don't want to become desensitized to it, but you also have to acknowledge how it's affecting you.
Yes, yes, for sure.
Mhm. So, when other therapists are trying to figure out who they want to work with, what populations to get into, and if they decide to work with clients who've specifically gone through some sort of trauma or like significant life changes, what do you
Mhm.
think it's important for therapists to know before working with this population?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think among other things, having some sort of trauma training, and there's many different types of trauma training. You don't have to be the expert in trauma because I feel like many of our clients come to us with some sort of trauma. It's
Yeah.
not something you can avoid. So whether that's trauma informed CBT, the TFCBT, trauma focused rather,
Mhm.
or EMDR, or brain spotting, or any number of things that people can do. There's a cognitive processing therapy, etc.
Mhm.
So that's important. And then the other piece too is knowing how to unplug and do self care because I've struggled with this. I know a number of therapists who have struggled with this. Because even if you think, okay, I'm compartmentalizing, I can leave work at work, your body doesn't always leave it at work.
Mm.
These things affect us as we're hearing them in the moment, and we're carrying that home with us. So, finding ways to really sort of flush that out. Again, not to discard, not to say, like, oh, I'm going to forget that I heard this today, but
Yeah.
just to put it away somewhere so you can enjoy the rest of your time outside of the therapy session and to really do that self care. And self care, mani pedis are great, but we're talking about that self care that really, revitalizes you spiritually and emotionally.
Oh, for sure. And that's something I know my program was missing, was how
Mm.
do you take care of yourself? Because I feel
Mhm.
like my program and the majority of and even like internships and different things like that I can think of, none of them ever talked about, like, the therapist,
Mm,
not as a
mhm.
person, right? You're
Yeah.
just the tool for the client, and
Mm.
so that's, part of why I made this channel is because I feel like there's a lot of gaps in education at times,
Yes.
and I understand, grad school, you have to, like, fit in a lot of different things at once, so I'm sure you
Sure.
include this in your classes, which makes me excited to think about things
Mhm.
changing, but yeah, I feel like there was never anything put on how the therapist should take care of themselves. It was, here's different theories, here's how those might look, here's research statistic, stuff like that, but there wasn't a
Mhm.
lot of emphasis on, like, how do you sustain yourself in this field.
Right.
So I really like that idea. And I listened to a podcast this morning. It was like a celebrity talking about a show that they're on. You can
Mhm.
tell I love all the famous stuff, but the pop culture stuff. But the girl was talking about this, like, character she played who's gone through a ton of relationship trauma. And the person
Mhm.
interviewing her said, well, when you go home, are you just able to, like, drop that? And she said, well, my brain understands that, like, all of it was fake, but my body experienced it while I was acting.
Mhm.
And it
Right.
doesn't know that it was fake because it
Yes.
felt it. And I
Uh-huh.
think it's a similar thing for us as therapists sometimes, right? And you could speak on it more than I could probably with the trauma piece, but
Mhm.
hearing these stories and taking this in, there's a lot of vicarious trauma that can happen sometimes for the therapist. So, what are some of your self-care things, or how do you, like, decompress after sessions or after hard days?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I agree that, yeah, your body experiences it somatically. Even just a little feeling of a jolt in a session when you hear something, you may not show the surprise on your face, but you're like, my God, what they went through. Um, So as far as what I do, managing how big my caseload is. So
Okay.
during COVID, I think many of my colleagues did this as well. There was so much need. They were like, "Well, I'll see people Saturday morning. I'll see people late into the night, Wednesday night." We did whatever we could to fill in those gaps, and that is a recipe for burnout. So
Mhm.
managing how many cases I'm having, the mix of cases, it doesn't have to be all trauma all the time when we specialize. Just like my colleagues do eating disorders, it's
Mhm.
not always, if they're in private practice, maybe not all their clients are eating disorder clients. It is just some of them are. Um, and so I think that's a big part of it, along with making that time for yourself. So I like to take walks. You've seen my cat on camera. I have a couple
Yes.
of cats, make time for my husband, my friends, my family. And that helps a ton to remember that I'm still a worthy person and I deserve the same treatment I'm advocating for my clients. So
Mm.
I can't be burning myself out or ignoring my family and friends or ignoring who I am because I would never advocate for a client doing that.
Yeah, ooh, and there's a lot of unintentional hypocrisy that we all do
Mhm.
in
Oh,
sessions where
yeah.
it's like, drink a lot of water, make sure you're eating healthy, and, like,
Uh-huh.
doing your stretches, and then we'll sit here in the same chair for 8 hours a day.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think it's definitely a practice which you preach, and I love how the
Mhm.
first thing you said was managing your caseload,
Mhm.
because I think sometimes, especially with newer therapists who are still trying to find that balance, it's like, "Let me get as much experience as possible. Let me see all of the people I can see. Let me get my hours,"
Mhm.
or, "I've gotta help everybody."
Right.
And you really have to put that balance in for yourself. So, and I like that you
Exactly.
mentioned different types of self-care. You're like, here's the stuff I
Mhm.
do for me. Here's the stuff that I do with family. Here's how I connect to who I am outside of the
Yes.
session. It's really nice.
Yeah.
And animals help.
Yeah, they definitely do.
Yeah. The best part, I think, of working from home is having them. So I
Yeah.
love that. But well, speaking of new therapists, if there
Mhm.
are people who are still trying to figure out who they want to work with and they are, maybe seeking this extra support, watching these episodes and stuff, trying to figure out where to go from here and how to like enter this field and
Mhm.
learn more about different things. Like, what do you think that they should do to increase their knowledge of working with clients who've gone through trauma, but then also that resiliency piece as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I think it depends, what you're exposed to personally and professionally. So
Mhm.
if you're feeling, I saw this in the substance abuse field too. So I come from a family with an alcoholic parent,
Mhm.
and I remember early on a supervisor expressing great concern about that, about whether or not I could work with people with substance abuse issues because I grew up in that environment and having to actually even as a practicum student, me assuring her, me advocating for myself, I've done the work, I've
Yeah.
had therapy, I've been to Al-Anon, I can do this. But I do see in hindsight also why there was a concern. So
Mhm.
I think it's similar for trauma. If you've resolved most of your trauma, because I think that's an ever-going process as you hit different life stages, things come up that feel a little bit different. I've
Mhm.
noticed when I've become the ages I remember my parents being in certain times in my childhood, things come up all over again. Not the same way, not as strongly, but it's
Mhm.
like, ooh, it hits differently.
Oh, I hear that with parents a lot too. When they have kids and their
Okay.
kids are the same ages or life stages.
Oh, you see?
Mhm.
So it's never the work is never done.
Yeah.
But being aware of that and having that insight is a must. And then as far as looking at the population, I think especially early in your career, it's a good idea to try and get exposed to different populations and see what is resonating. What can I continue doing? And like you mentioned earlier, it's you can evolve over time. You can shift gears over time. So I've worked in substance abuse counseling and college counseling, and then I went into private practice. And there's always so much we could do with the field.
Yeah.
So not to pigeonhole yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And to try to get it sounds like the main thing you're saying is get as much exposure as possible to different
Mhm.
types of people. Cause like you mentioned about it evolving and how yours evolved. It's like you might have not gone into the field thinking substance abuse was going to be the focus. But
Mhm.
then getting to that facility and so many people had co-occurring disorders that
Mhm.
shifted a bit to like, oh, I'm actually doing mostly trauma work probably on a
Uh-huh.
daily basis with a
Right.
side of substance abuse. So
Mhm.
I think, yeah, it's not really black and white at all in this
Yeah,
field. So,
exactly.
yeah, getting a lot of exposure. And then you had mentioned also trauma trainings. So, in an earlier question, why EMDR? Why was that the one that you picked?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. So I got trained in 2014, 2015, and I feel like there weren't a lot of different trauma trainings. If you're looking at trauma, EMDR seemed to be the front runner.
Mhm.
In addition, a colleague I very much trusted was like, EMDR is amazing, and you can do this and the other with it. So I think those two things together led me toward that path. And then, reading up my own, like, oh, who's Francine Shapiro, so, the founder of EMDR, and what does the research say? And all of it seemed to come together to make me go, yeah, that's what I want to do. I think there's been a lot more that's come up in recent years. Somatic experiencing from Peter Levine comes to mind, and other ones. Um, so I mean, so as far that's why I chose mine. But I would encourage anyone who's interested because there are so many different types. Pick what resonates with you.
Yeah.
I have a colleague who's looking at doing more trauma narrative work. I
Oh,
mean, heck, that's wonderful and it's needed.
yeah.
So whatever resonates with what you're being pulled to, because like you said, if you don't have the passion, then you're more likely to burn out.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're right. There are a lot of different ones out there, so I think finding what works for you as a clinician makes sense. I know I was trained when I worked with the military on CPT, like cognitive processing, and then
Mm-hmm.
prolonged
Yeah.
exposure, and I
Uh-huh.
didn't love either of them.
Sure. They
um,
can be very arduous. Yeah.
yeah, and it just the population I was working with military, they were not receptive at that point to most
Mm-hmm.
most of them weren't receptive to it either because it's just very step by step and lots of homework on their end and they
Yes.
just didn't really have a lot at the time. So
Mm-hmm.
um but yeah, EMDR I think's great. I got trained in brain spotting too and I
Okay.
really like that one. That one felt more at home for me.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I like that you also took a couple years. working with the population to then feel out like, okay, now how can I
Mhm.
further my education? Because
Yes,
not everything is going to be presented in school. So it's nice that you then
right.
sought out training or certification in a specialized way of helping the population.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
awesome. Well, I know you work with a lot of new therapists and,
Yes.
or future therapists. And so, are there any additional tips in general that you would give to all the newbies coming into the field?
Oh my goodness, it's such a great question. Because I've been really heartened to see how many people are coming into the field because we do have a critical shortage of therapists in this
Yes.
country. So my big thing I think would be that you don't have to be perfect. Because
Mm,
I think that is something a lot of people, and I was like this too. If I say something wrong in a session, oh my gosh, my entire relationship with the client will be ruined and my life will be ruined. And of
mhm,
course, that's usually not true. I say usually because you always have someone who might take something the wrong way and not come back. That is life. But
mhm,
generally speaking, that's not what happens. And I learned early on if there's some sort of rupture, I misspeak or I say something and it's misinterpreted, that we can circle back to it, have that healthy confrontation, talk about what I could have done differently and repair and move forward.
mm.
And that's been so helpful, not just in the therapy room, but in all my relationships over time.
Yeah, and that could be very healing for the client as well, because they may have never had somebody who acknowledged their part in a situation or, taken the lead on anything, or been presented with an opportunity to even have some of those discussions.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
exactly.
and things happen because we're all people. So,
Right.
yeah. So, any other tips that you could think of for new therapists?
Mhm. Yeah, so you don't have to be perfect.
Mhm.
And also that you do want to practice, practice, practice. Because
Okay.
sometimes, like you mentioned, I started off in substance abuse and then this, that, the other happened. Um, Knowing that you can be open to different experiences and trying different things. If someone says, hey, we need help with this support group, and you have the time and capacity, go help with it, even if it's something you hadn't considered before. Or
Yeah.
if someone's looking for, a PRN in a hospital, you've not worked in a hospital, maybe give it a try. Because I think sometimes people kind of figure, well, therapy is just the one thing I'm doing right now. Like if they have a vision of, I'm going to go into private practice, or if I'm only going to work at a school. And I
Mhm.
think we have to be more flexible and more mobile.
Oh, absolutely. Because then your life changes as a person over time.
Hmm.
So I've
Yeah.
now, I graduated in 2012. So I've been doing
Mm,
this for a bit. And so
yeah.
I've even seen like as some friends or colleagues have either had kids, have moved, have
Uh-huh.
burned out in one aspect of the field and need to switch to another, whatever
Right.
else has gone on. There's so much the adaptation. I don't
Hmm.
really know anybody I can think of that is in the same place now that they started. So
Hmm.
even with the same
Yes.
populations. So, yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
I like that. Be open and flexible too. And I wish that was something that was emphasized more in programs too. Cause I know a lot of times it's funny, like mentoring some new therapists over the last few years. One of them was like, it's come up a bit, but said something like, well, what is the modality that I defined by? Like what should be my thing? And I'm like, what? That nobody's ever gonna ask you what your modality is once you graduate. No one's gonna ask you.
Mhm.
Clients typically don't even know what you're talking. If they see all the letters, CBT, ACT, whatever, they don't even know what
Right.
like,
Uh-huh.
and you don't have to define yourself by this one thing. So I
Right.
I like that you're talking about the flexibility because I feel like people get stuck, whether it's like a topic of a paper or something that's making them feel like I need to know who I am, what theory.
Right. Right. Sometimes I think that's fear. And it's like, I need to know step by step how I deal with this client because I'm overwhelmed with what they're bringing in.
Hmm. Yeah, and they need the box. Safe.
Uh-huh. Yes. Which
Oh,
brings up a whole discussion of like how do we make people feel safer and let them know they already have the tools they need. Because
mhm,
again, you don't have to be perfect in any modality for it to be very effective with people. And
mhm,
I consider myself, primarily a CBT therapist, even
mhm,
though of course I do EMDR and trauma therapy. And then like I'm eclectic in a lot of ways. I'll pull things from DBT as needed. I'll pull things from ACT. I'll pull from like ERP, the exposure and response prevention for OCD,
Yeah.
whatever we happen to need. And the more of those tools you have to pull from your toolbox, the better it's going to be for the client. And I think that's what I mean about that flexibility, being nimble. And yeah, I really think the rigidity comes from just the fear of that unknown. And I
Mhm.
think part of that is our clients are coming in with new issues that we weren't prepared for back in 2012. I
Yeah.
mean, everything with online dating and
Uh-huh.
AI and job insecurity and the rent is too high. This wasn't happening when we were first trained.
Mhm. Yeah, and even, like, with COVID, oh my god, it was, like, the first time
Oh my lord.
therapists were living the same stressors that all of our
Hmm.
clients were going through.
Yes.
So, yeah, that threw everybody through the loop, but, yeah, I think there's just a lot of stuff that we have to be open to adapting to for ourselves and definitely with clients too. So, I like how you said, like, toolbox of different things, like, find the aspects of different types of therapy you relate to. You don't have to be defined by, like, this one
Mm-mm.
modality or theory or whatever.
Right.
So, yeah. Well, it's a good note, I think, to end it on. Be flexible. Don't be perfect because
Yes.
nobody is. Nobody likes the
Hmm.
person who thinks they're perfect either. So, like,
Exactly.
yeah. So let it be. But yeah. So the last thing actually I wanted to talk about was different things that you're working on right now. So
Hmm.
what do you got going on?
Yeah, so I'm branching out a little bit, from the therapy room. I've got a YouTube channel that I'm also launching,
Oh,
and it's going to look at resiliency, mental health, and climate change, but also other topics that come up that are of interest. It's not just for therapists, but also for the general public,
nice.
hopefully to inform them about these different things. Um, so I'm working on that. I'm starting a blog with Psychology Today, specifically about mental health and climate change, just to
Hmm.
help people build up that resiliency. I grew up in South Florida where hurricanes were the norm, but that's not everywhere. Oh, are you from there too?
I grew up in Miami.
Get
Yeah.
out. I'm from Coral Springs.
Oh my gosh, perfect. Yeah, so I
Yeah.
know when you said climate change, it was the first thing that I had thought about was like the
Mhm.
millions of hurricanes that I have been through.
Yes,
Oh, that's
exactly.
mhm.
And that can take a toll over time, especially when we look at towns and cities that were decimated. Hurricane Andrew in
That's
1992,
what
I
I've
was,
been through. Uh-huh.
yeah, same. I was up the road in Coral Springs when that happened. And
Yeah.
yeah, so we're going to look at all those different things, get people ready. Because, like I mentioned earlier with trauma, you're never going to be able to go back to the way things were, but you can
Mhm.
still have peace and contentment in new normal.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Oh, that just made me even more happy. I'm like, yeah, it's like you definitely know what you're talking about on a personal level, having lived through
Mhm.
so much of this as well.
Yes.
So
Oh,
that'll be fun for you as a therapist to like explore some of that in the therapeutic side and be able to use a lot of your personal experiences because I feel like different I don't know, material, whether it's, talks, whether it's books, whatever it is, it's
mhm.
so much more impactful to me at least when I know the person has experienced in some level what they're
Oh,
talking about. You didn't just like learn it in a book. So
right.
I really like that.
Awesome.
Well, I'm gonna link all of your stuff below so
Thank
everybody
you.
can check it out. They can subscribe to your channel too. And I just appreciate you taking the time today to do this. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Yay. Well, for the viewers, if you guys want to follow along with future episodes, go ahead and subscribe to my channel as well. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.